1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is wine writer and critic Christina Pickard. Christina is wine writer at large for Wine Enthusiast, with an eclectic beat covering Australia, New Zealand, England, and New York State, where she resides. That remit takes in some pretty schmick sparkling wine, and Christina loves her fizz, so much so that we recorded a bonus segment on that subject alone. For this conversation, however, we talked about narrating the nuptials of Wills and Kate and other adventures in TV, how to blag your way into a Lebanese reporting trip, the unedifying realities of Edinburgh Festival, friendships forged in the freewheeling natural wine scene, the lowdown on hybrids, a fruitful side hustle at London's United Nations of Wine, the blessing and curse of Kiwi Sauvignon Blanc, and what Americans think about Australia, if they think about it at all. I started by asking Christina about her early days.
I grew up in the sticks, just outside the Finger Lakes, really at the edge of the Finger Lakes region.
Near Skinny Atlas Lake, which is not as known for wine as some of the other lakes, but not far from those more wine-centric lakes. There's a few wineries there.
But I grew up in a little tiny Erie Canal town. It was a little historic town, but very rural, very small, not a lot of diversity. I think my graduating class was like 120 people. But I was really fortunate, I think, to come from a family, a very loud Italian-American family that really encouraged, especially as I got older, sort of encouraged travel. And my mother was really into the arts. Both my sibling and I were very drawn to the theater and really, really caught the theater bug early on because she and my grandma would take us to musicals. And, I remember going down to New York City, and that was a big trip, driving that sort of 5 hours to New York City and seeing some shows on Broadway. And we were always seeing theater. And so I really grew up with a love of the arts. But wine was really on the peripheral. I mean, my parents drank wine. It was in the house. When I got old enough to drink wine, it was the only thing I could even think of to drink because that's all that they drank. I mean, my dad had beer too, but wine was what they always had at the dinner table. I just have such memories of my mom drinking these really rich, buttery, old school 80s and 90s California Chardonnays while she was cooking. So that was just a real part of my sort of everyday, household drinking, I guess. I never obviously had any because I was, very underage. We were not of the sort of European Italian mentality of like, here, have a little glass at dinner, even, as a teenager. Like, no, I didn't even taste it until well into, my late teens, college years. But yeah, she would drink that, and my dad would drink those big fruity zins and cabs and nothing fancy. I remember at Christmas, he would wrap up some bottles for my mom for Christmas that would be, a little bit more maybe mid-tier. That was considered fancy. If it was $20, I don't even remember. I need to actually like pick their brains for the brands. But if it was sort of a $20 bottle, that was fancy for them. And that was like the Christmas wine they wrapped up.
And what about the Italian influence in terms of the table being an important place? Did you have sort of family meals and discussions and cultural debates and good food around?
Yes, I think that stereotype probably did ring true. Every Sunday, without fail, we went to my Grandma Josie and Grandpa Joe's house, and we would have the big meal. My grandma's still kicking, and she still makes the same thing. It would be eggplant parmesan or eggplant patties or meatballs, sauce, spaghetti, all of that. Every Sunday, without fail, the exact same meal. And, there was always wine. My grandmother didn't drink. Her parents emigrated from Calabria and Sicily. I guess this would have been like in the 20s, 30s. And he did, I found this out just recently, that he did make wine in the basement, the way a lot of Italians did in the time, had like probably his own little basket press down there and would get probably, I can't get many details out of her, but probably fruit from the Finger Lakes, who knows what it was, probably some old hybrids, and made wine in the basement. But she didn't touch it. My grandfather had, maybe that much. It was mostly my parents. they were the ones that really brought the wine to the table.
Yeah, cool. Well, I definitely want to dig into the New York State wine situation later on in the conversation, because it's a place that not many people know that much about, and a place where lots of exciting things by the looks of things are going on. But back to you, when you were young, you mentioned going to the theatre, going to see shows. That was a big thing personally as well, the performative side of life. Tell me a little bit about that.
So for a long time, I thought I wanted to be a writer, and that's definitely what my mom was really grooming me for. She was an English teacher. I would go to writing camps. It was, the only subject in school that I just consistently found easy and did well in. So I think there was for a long time this idea that, my future was in writing. And then I caught the theater bug. And that was really what I remember doing my first show in like 7th grade. So I was maybe 12 years old in school, and just thought, this is incredible. I completely caught the bug. That was it for the writing for a while, and just thought, this is what I want to do. And my sibling was really always the one who was really, from the age he could walk and talk, into performance. I think my parents were a little surprised. They never expected me to be the one to also pursue that. Went to Ithaca College, right in the heart of the Finger Lakes on Cayuga Lake. They have a really good drama program, and did a BA in drama, and was, really thought like, this is going to be my life. I'm going to act. This is what I want to do, and then, and then actually got out there in the world and was like, oh, this is really hard. I'm not sure my skin is actually thick enough for this industry. I found that it's probably like a lot of careers in the arts where it doesn't necessarily matter how good you are. Of course it matters. Like, talent has to be a given, but so much was just about like right place at the right time and just luck. And I thought, oh God, I want to be in an industry where I can like work hard and my work actually can pay off. Like, I can start to actually see some kind of progression in that career. But yeah, that was later on. But for a long time, I was very head down. This is what I want to do is be an actor.
And what were the highlights that you did reach? Did you come close to, breakthroughs that really excited you? Or what was the funnest role you played?
So I did a semester in London, and then really in London was where I started to pursue it professionally. I did a postgrad in musical theater. I'm sure, and it's all a blur because I honestly have sort of blocked that part of my life out a little bit. I did some fun stuff. Like, I went to the Edinburgh Festival. I kept getting close to things. I had an agent. I had a great voiceover agent. I actually had more fiscal success on the voiceover side of things. Voiced in video games, and did the Royal West 6-part documentary of the Royal Wedding. I don't know why they wanted an American to do that. This was the...
Which wedding?
William and Kate. This was right. William and Kate. Yeah, for the Lifetime channel in the States. I just discovered you can still buy this documentary. This is the box set on Amazon, Ed, if you'd like to indulge. But on the stage side, I just kept getting close to things. I remember I was down to recalls for We Will Rock You, for Wicked, for Phantom of the Opera, like getting to actually do these recalls on the stage on the West End, and just getting so close. And then, so I would say there was nothing like really on the stage that I really am like proud to parade around, but it was an interesting experience.
And you've ended up moving back, not a million miles away from where you grew up, but like a lot of people, I gather you had a desire to get out and get far away from home and get into the big wide world. And that was London then. Tell us a little bit more about what happened there.
Yeah, I couldn't wait to get out of my small town. Lovely people there, nothing against the community there, but 17, 18, I was like, I am out of here. And so did a study abroad program in my college. Ithaca has a London center. So that was sort of my way into London. Just absolutely fell in love with London. Did a few semesters abroad in New York City, and just thought, maybe I just like to be in a big city, and thought, no, I was never, and to this day, New York is still not really my city. Even though I live 90 miles away from it, it's not my city. I still go to London and feel this sense of like, oh, I'm home. Part of it is I ended up living 10, 11 years in London. Went back to study there, did all the day jobs, nannied, waitressed, all of that. But really caught the wine bug, where wine comes in, was around 2007 or so. A friend of mine who is also an actor said, hey, I've got this day job, and I know you really like to drink wine, and I've got this day job at this place called Vininspo if you want to come work here. And I thought, well, that sounds a lot better than nannying and waitressing. Like, I'll go, drink some wine and get paid for it. And Vininspo was this sort of incubator at the time. I didn't realize it until later, but ended up serving as an incubator for a lot of us at that sort of time period between maybe 2007 and 2012, 2013, and then it shut shortly after that. But it was this sort of tourist experience, wine-centric tourist experience underneath the arches of London Bridge. It felt like you were down in a cave in Burgundy or something. It was sort of Stephen Spurrier and Oz Clarke and those old boys at the time who were really behind it. So really exciting in terms of a place to learn about wine. But for a long time for me at Vinopolis, it was just a day job. I just thought, well, I'm just going to pour some wine, drink a bit of it as well. But I kept auditioning. I had agents. It was very much just a part-time thing.
But it must have been, I'm assuming, the fact that you're, used to presenting and talking, quite fun engaging with people over wine in that job?
Totally. And I think why it was such a perfect fit for me was because there was that like presenting element. We had this amphitheater. It was a fake amphitheater, and we'd, give these talks to groups about how to taste wine, and we'd bring some groups through. There was private tastings. So yeah, there was a lovely presenting side of things that I got to use an element of my acting skills. And I guess thinking about it now, I guess it planted the seed that like, oh, hey, I could use these acting skills, not necessarily on stage. Like there are other careers in which these skills might come in handy.
And they did on TV, didn't they, in the UK?
They did. A show called Market Kitchen, which was on the BBC Good Food Network, called Vinopolis and said, do you happen to have any Americans who can come talk about wine and feel comfortable in front of the camera? Which is a really specific request now that I think about it. And they said, actually, we do. Because Vinopolis was a bit of a United Nations. We really did have everybody from every country. It was a pretty cool experience. And that's how London is anyway. I love the diversity of London, the multiculturalism. Yeah, so I went on Market Kitchen as a guest to talk about American wines, and then ended up getting kind of called back, I guess, as a semi-regular. They'd get me on to do really silly things like a beer World Cup and dress me up in like a cheerleader's costume. And there was some quite ridiculous things that I look back and I just think, wow, they really took advantage there. But it was obviously fantastic for me from a like launch pad into thinking, okay, I could maybe use these two skills. They could be combined, the theater background and this sort of, at the time, burgeoning wine knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, I guess skills aside, just the very fact that you were the kind of person that would throw yourself into that. People are terrified of being on camera. People are terrified of even having their photo taken in much of the wine industry, let alone being on camera, on television, and ad-libbing, dressing up. But obviously you took to that like a duck to water. I
did. Yeah.
So what happened after Vinopolis?
So I took a break from Vinopolis to do this show at the Edinburgh Festival that was, shall we say, a pretty horrible experience. And I think I had like less than 10 pounds to my name. And I thought, I'm now like entering my late 20s, which felt so old at the time. I think I was like 26 and feeling like, I got to get my life together. And I remember on the train ride home from Edinburgh Festival, just having this real make or break moment where I thought, okay, Christina, this is it. Like, I think you need to, because I already sort of caught the wine bug, but I was still kind of like 1 foot in theater, 1 foot in wine. I think, I need to just go whole hog wine. And on that train ride home, kind of made 2 lists of, ways to get more sort of short-term, long-term goals in the wine industry, to get myself more deeply involved in that and more serious about that. And then the other side of the list was ways to sort of disconnect myself from the theater world and to, drop my agent and unsubscribe from casting websites and all of that. And, I remember my husband at the time was like, yeah, okay, thinking like, oh, this is just Christina's next thing, whatever, she'll move on and there'll be something else in a couple of years. So I think I surprised him, and maybe part of it was just wanting to prove him wrong, but just thought, no, I'm committing to this wine thing. I ended up taking on more shifts at Vinopolis, and then it gets a little bit blurry. By the time I left Vinopolis, I had enough other gigs, but I was definitely pursuing the presenting side of things, working with PR companies to just do some sort of ambassador roles, things that would just get me out speaking in front of people. And then I ended up writing, and that kind of fell into my lap. A decanter feature fell. I made it happen, but it was also just sort of right place at the right time. I had been writing a blog and a newsletter, so it's not like I hadn't been doing some writing, but getting a decanter feature on the CV was definitely a good way to sort of move into writing.
What was that first decanter piece on?
It was on Lebanon. So there was a campaign in the UK at the time, a Wines of Lebanon campaign. They had kind of just formed this group. And I remember it was a bit, when I think back, I thought, God, I was a little gutsy. I remember speaking to the campaign, the PR person, and saying, at one of the Wines of Lebanon tasting, one of the trade tastings, and saying, well, I could write a decanter feature. If you can get me to Lebanon, I can write a decanter feature. I hadn't spoken to Decanter at all about this. And she went, oh, all right, I'll put you on the list. We'll get you to Lebanon. And then I got a meeting with the Decanter editor-in-chief at the time and said, I'm going to be going to Lebanon. So if you'd like an article, I somehow managed to play the two of them off each other. One of the guys on the trip with me, my colleague, who ended up being my editor, and I love him, but he was the Decanter editor. So I think he was a bit like, wait, I thought I was going on this trip to write it. And I was like, oh, I don't know, but they just commissioned me to write it. And, it wasn't as conniving or as scheming as it all sounds. It was more one of those like, well, I think, I've told them this, and it all just worked out. Yeah, it's the only time in my life I think I could ever be that smooth. And it has not happened since.
And what was that trip like, actually?
It was fascinating. It was like 10 days or so, maybe not 10. It was maybe a week. It was the longest press trip to this day I've ever done, which is this one region. And Oz Clarke was on there and some other really great wine writers. And we went all over Lebanon, and it was really eye-opening. And that's where my initial writing, a lot of the stories that I was able to get placed in UK publications were on these lesser known regions, because people like Decanter had reviewers and writers at large like I am now, or contributing editors who were covering all the main regions. So where I was able to sort of sneak in was like on that Lebanon feature, or I remember writing a couple of features on Istria and Croatia, because nobody was covering that. And so it was really, really fascinating place to write. I mean, talk about like for your first feature, so much rich storytelling in Lebanon. And it's still been a country that fascinates me. I don't write about it as much as I'd like to anymore, but I still keep in touch with some of those producers. I've still given it coverage when I can, because I think it's just a super fascinating place.
Yeah, absolutely. And very sad that a lot of the coverage has turned to obviously conflict, but at the same time, it's great that those stories have actually got eyes on that part of the world looking at it differently, and it continues to be fascinating, and hopefully we'll be talking much more about the positive side of that and progress in future times. So London you loved, but all good things come to an end. How did that morph into the next chapter?
Well, I was there for 11 years, so it was a good stretch of time. It was essentially almost all my 20s and into my early 30s, and I met an Aussie there. You know how that goes, Ed. Met an Aussie, and he was really fed up with the weather about 5 years earlier than I was. At that point, we were married. We got married when we were still living there. And he had been saying for a lot of years, like, I really need some sunshine. I really got to get out of this city. And he's also 4 years older than me. So I do think you reach sort of a point. I think I hit about 30 and went, all right, yeah, it'd be nice to have some space and a backyard. And yeah, I agree. This weather's pretty depressing. I'd like a bit more sunshine. So end of 2012, we left and moved to Perth, where he's from in Western Australia. And it was real nice. We moved in January, so leaving London in January to the middle of summer in Perth. And it's like sunny every day in Perth that time of year. It was a pretty fantastic weather swap, I'll say.
Yeah, definitely different from grimy January London for sure. We had a great conversation with Erin Larkin on episode 3 of the podcast with a lot of Perth chat and WA chat, but very interested to hear about it from the outside. What was Perth like as a city to move to, and what kind of wine scene did you discover when you got there?
Well, so this was January 2013 I moved. So, we're talking now like 12 years ago. So the scene has definitely changed in that time. I would say one of the biggest shifts for me was getting used to a wine scene that was much more winemaker centric. London, obviously there's a lot of wine people, but they're not actually winemakers. They're, somms and importers and writers and all these people talking about wine. And then to suddenly be more in a place where there was people actually making the stuff we were talking about was, first of all, a very humbling experience, because I kind of went in there guns a-blazing. I had gone down a very deep natural wine road in London, and it was, I still talk natural wine is why I got into wine. I have evolved somewhat. I still very much follow that scene and love that scene. I would say my palate's probably evolved a bit, but I came in, like that was all I drank. That was all I talked about, just having been really deep in the natty side. And that was a really formative time for Australia as well, that sort of 2012, 2013, 14, those years. I look back and cringe definitely at some of the things I said and wrote. There was a lot for me to learn in terms of suddenly being in an industry or in a scene. These were the people that were actually doing the hard work to craft these wines. Just to wrapping my head around the industry there, it was obviously a lot smaller. There were very few writers there at the time. The scene was more somms and some beverage directors. And I remember the small bar license had changed pretty recently. So it was a really exciting time for a lot of cool new bars and restaurants opening up. But it definitely had more of a small town feel in comparison to London. So that was an adjustment as well. Yeah, really interesting learning curve for me.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, I guess you've got a couple of things there. One, obviously, as an international person going to one of the most remote parts of Australia, the most remote capital city in Australia, I guess you're going from quite that big world, London, mega multicultural, as you say, the United Nations that you worked with at Vinopolis, into that rather more remote culture, I suppose, there. And also from a natural wine-loving background to a relatively conservative, but progressive, certainly now, Australian winemaking scene as well. So I guess you were right in the middle of those things. But did you enjoy those times?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, like I say, there's definitely moments that I look back on and cringe a little bit. But, I think there's really important moments in your sort of trajectory of your career, I guess, that you can only have insight on with hindsight. And I see those years as really important, not only to what I'm doing now with like my work at Wine Enthusiast and really championing Aussie wines, but also just with the learning. I think it was really important for writers to be deep in a wine scene. I mean, especially as somebody who hasn't really got my hands dirty too much working a vintage, and I probably should. I still am a bit embarrassed to admit that. But, I think it's important to get to these regions and spend time there and really just see the inner workings of the way a winery works and the way that a wine scene works from a winemaker's and a wine grower's perspective. And so that was really interesting for me. But it was just a fascinating time to be in Australia. It was, from the natty perspective, it was the rootstocks, the first natural wine fairs. And I flew over to Sydney for several of them, and to be part of that and to see this like community that was coming up on that side of it was a really exciting thing to be part of. At least on the fringe.
Yeah, and saying that, Australia, I would say the winemakers here really do like people to dig in properly with their curiosity and ask questions. They're really not shy of having people peek in and showing them what they do. And I think that's one of the really lovely things about the Australian wine culture, whether you're talking the nattier side of things or the other end of the spectrum. But on the natural side, I think that that's really interesting, both that energy that was there when you first came to Australia, and perhaps a scene that even with hindsight probably is better understood. And I know that you recently did a bit of a trip around seeing some people that you got to know well in those days. And I really sensed the affection that you'd had for that time, that energy. A lot of those people are still going great guns and have lost absolutely none of the vim and vigour of what they do. People like Anton Van Klopper at Luciem, James Erskine at Jaume, really living that culture, that philosophy that they had back then, absolutely wholeheartedly. Tell us a little bit about what that vibe, and maybe the point that perhaps some people missed, if that is the case, in terms of why the natural wine scene was exciting and continues to have an element of difference that is important in the wine scene in general.
Probably the best way to put it is, for me personally, I think that what it did for me with wine is probably exemplary of what it has done for so many folks, especially at that time. And I would argue, at least in the States, is still doing now, which is that it got particularly young people into wine in a way that I think so much more quote unquote conventional wine struggles to do. And we have so many conversations, and we're still having them now. We were having them 15 years ago. How do we get young people to drink wine? How do we make it more accessible? Well, the natty wine scene does that. I mean, you go, down to Brooklyn and walk around the streets, like there's young people drinking wine, but they're drinking cloudy pet nats, still in New York. I mean, I think the scene has changed a little bit from what I saw in Australia. I do think there's been a little bit more pendulum swinging there over the years, but it's still going full guns here in the States. Whether that changes, sometimes I do wonder if Australia is a bit of a canary in the coal mine with that, and we'll see where it goes in the coming years. But I think that people got so caught up, particularly in Australia, and this is why I think that natural wine had such a massive impact in Oz, and arguably more so than anywhere else in the world, because Australia has its wine show system, and it was particularly then so technically focused. There was the criticism often levied at a lot of Aussie wines was that they were too technical, they were too homogenous, they were, boring. The whole Aussie wine show scene was like such a cultural shock to me. That sort of how like deeply ingrained the wine show is to Australian culture. It's really hard to explain it to Americans because that doesn't exist here. And that's such a deep part of the wine scene there. So to me, it makes total sense that a culture like that is so, into this sort of improving the breed, which now I have come to really have a lot of respect for the wine show, a lot more respect than I did. It's taken me a long time to get there, but perhaps it's because now I review wines and score them as part of my living. So I definitely have more understanding of the purpose that they serve. But I also get the inclination to rail against that. And I think for me, like what really captured my interest and passion in this side of the industry was how grassroots, like it was kind of just sticking the middle finger up to the whole convention of winemaking and saying, we don't need to get bogged down in all this technical stuff. Like it's fun and we can sort of tie in these environmental messages. But honestly, it was more just about like walking the walk of this movement that said, we're breaking all the rules and we don't care. And I think there's something like rock and roll about that. There's something really edgy and attractive. And, it helps that there's these really colorful characters behind all of these wines. And so it's very hard, especially as a 20-something, not to get swept up in that world. I came from standing behind a table at Vinopolis, going, okay, this is this, and this is how, this is what a Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc is supposed to taste like, and this is what a Rhone, Syrah is supposed to taste like, and this is this. And it was very, I learned through the way a lot of us learn through the WSETs in this very scripted way. And, the WSETs right from the beginning teach you, is this, mark full-bodied, medium full-bodied, like, it's very technical and there's not a lot of room for error, even though wine is actually a very subjective thing. And so, of course, when I look back, it was attractive to be introduced to this whole side of wine that was, like, yeah, sure, it's cloudy and it's fizzy and we don't care about the grape variety. We don't really even care about where it's from. It's just fun and it has this fun label on it and we're just having fun with it. I think sometimes it feels to those who are on the outside of it like it's a club that they're not invited to. And well, why am I? Because I'm not using a lot of sulfur and I'm not. And there is a point to that. I really see both sides. And especially now that I am really tasting wines. I taste wines now from the most commercial wines to these really, really high end, from historic wineries to the nattiest. Like I really am very fortunate in my role to taste now a huge range of wines. I get why people get a little pissed off at like, well, why is he called natural and I'm not? I understand it. But I think ultimately it's more just a philosophy and a sort of way of being. Like you mentioned, Anton and James, these guys like live it. They embody what I guess I would describe as a natural movement or a natural philosophy.
Yeah, and I think probably from an outsider point of view, if you were to move that kind of debate away from wine into something else, I mean, in fairness, humans have a tendency to look in binary ways at things. You're either this or you're that. And I guess the extremes were very, very out there, rule breaking on the edge of everything. And on the other side, as square as all hell, playing safe, very, very technical. And of course, there is a spectrum in between those two things. And probably the people I feel were most misunderstood were probably those sort of small farmers who'd been literally gardening their vines and making their wines with absolutely no intervention. And they couldn't have been more natural. And they continue doing the same thing today. A lot of what we call pioneers, but of course in Australia they're relatively young, maybe second generation families who've always done it the same way and it's always been that traditional way. So again, it's not really two sides, it's actually a continuum, I guess. And at the moment, I think we're probably seeing lots of wines in that continuum being made really interestingly. And I think that that's the cool thing. Like a lot of people who are neither in this box or that box, but of course they're taking a bit of the fun and a bit of the edginess and a bit of the new and a bit of the excitement and mixing it with what they do as a business and having therefore a more diverse business and hopefully a more diverse customer base and being more relevant. And that's probably where it's really good that things were shaken up.
100%. No, I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah. It's a big topic, and I really can see a lot of sides. I can see a lot of sides of it. Like I say, it brings in this younger generation of people, and I think that that is really important, and it brings this fun element, as I mentioned, but also, I see a frustration there, especially if you're calling yourself natural and you're buying in fruit that is not organically farmed and biodynamically farmed. Like, I really can see a lot of sides of the spectrum, and, I still think it's an important part of the wine world, and sometimes, even though it really still only makes up, technically, however we want to define it, a pretty small percentage, I think the conversation around it and the way that the number of people it has gotten into wine, especially young people, is really uncountable. I don't think it's anything that we can actually put a number on, but it's had a really outsized and continues to have an outsized positive, I think, mostly positive impact on the wine world.
Yeah, as I said, my takeaway from your recent coverage on your trip to Australia was very much, you can see the friendships that occurred there and imagine all the conversations that have happened over wine. And that, to be fair, and the energy that brings is such a cool thing as far as I'm concerned. And we should probably shift our attention then to all the many things that you have covered, because during your time in WA, you were writing for quite a few different publications. How did your sort of beat change around when you were there? Just give us a little run through of who you were writing for and what kind of stuff you were covering.
Sure. So I got to Australia and pretty quickly got a wine section in a magazine called Scoop in Western Australia. It still exists, but not in the same way it used to. And it had this incredibly generous food and wine section of the magazine. So my predecessor had just retired, and it was, again, just right place at the right time. I think life is so often about that. And so I was handed the wine section, having just moved there, and it was all about WA wine. So talk about being thrown in the deep end of really having to get to know Western Australian wines quickly. So I was doing that, which was amazing. That was a quarterly magazine. Then was writing for, Halliday's magazine and Gourmet Traveler Wine, which I still, rest in peace, think was just one of the best wine magazines around. So writing for them, and then just continued to write for publications in the UK. It was in Australia, actually, that I started to freelance for Wine Enthusiast, which is where I mostly write now, although not exclusively, but that was really where I started to write for them. But I ran a wine school there as well. So it wasn't just writing. I started a wine school because I had come from doing all this education and presenting work in the UK, and just sort of naively thought I would go to Perth and pick that back up again, and then realized that didn't exist. If I wanted to do that kind of stuff, I had to really make it myself. And so I started this wine education course, really called School of Wine, but I was trying to make it like School of Rock, like the Jack Black film. I don't know how many people got that reference, but it gave me a little giggle every time. So I did that for a couple years, and really I sold it off, but it was one of those things where I was moving right when it was starting to really take off, but it was also a lot of work, and it made me realize oh, I don't actually want to run an events company, because that's really what it was. Ultimately I was doing the teaching and getting to choose the wines and everything, but it was events. But it got me out there in Perth. I would do these, sometimes some of them were corporate events, but a lot of them I would do at wine bars and restaurants. So I got to know all the sort of hospos in Perth, which was a really cool way to just get out there and connect with people.
Okay, we should, while we're in WA, just have a little overview, I think, of you're still covering that beat for Wine Enthusiast, and that's quite a broad remit that you have now, way beyond WA, across Australia, New Zealand, parts of the States and England. So I want to talk about all those things to some degree. But starting off with WA, what are the little nuggets that you think an international audience should take away when they are digging into that part of this country?
Oh man, the Cliff's Notes on WA, it's so hard. I would say, especially if you're international, because that's kind of, to me, that's a very different conversation than what you can get if you're on the ground in WA, because there's some gems you can find in the Swan Valley and the Perth Hills and Great Southern, but unfortunately very little bit of Great Southern, but very, very little of that makes it over. So most of the conversation for international drinkers is around Margaret River. I know I'm a little bit biased because I live there, but I truly think it's one of the most spectacular wine regions in the world, not just for its natural beauty, but because I just think that particularly the Cabernets and the Chardonnays that are coming out of there are just world class. You mentioned Erin Larkin, who is an old friend, and she also bangs the drum loudly for Margaret River Chardonnay. And I would also say Cabernet too, just in that they're both so distinctive. Part of it in Margaret River is you have this gin clone. So I really think the more that I have dived into and geeked out, I guess, about Margaret River, the more I realize I really think that clone makes a big difference, because it's really the only place in Oz that just focuses so much that you can really taste these 100% gin clone Chardonnays to the kind of breadth that you can there. So yeah, Chardonnays there, gorgeous. Cabernets also have this really distinctive sort of eucalypt, savory, seaweed quality to them. It's this very iron fist and velvet glove, elegance and power. I just think they're gorgeous wines. They come in at so reasonably priced here compared to where other cabs and Chardonnays of the world sit. I wouldn't say we get a lot of them, but we get some of the big players here. So in the States anyway, you can get Vas Felix and Cullen and Lewin and Woodlands and, those people who are really leading the charge, those bigger, better known, long-standing producers. So yeah, I could drink Margaret River Chardonnay every day, all day.
I also think it is an incredible climate. I think we're seeing a little bit more diversity sub-regionally and in terms of those single vineyard Chardonnays. But in terms of just the fruit profile, both the Chardonnay and Cabernet, the warmth of the climate mixed with those ocean breezes on three sides just means just a severe amount of flavour, which is gorgeous, but total freshness as well. I mean, it's just a winning combination, and it manages to produce Cabernet that is really so fleshily generous and beautiful, but fresh at the same time. Pretty special.
Yeah, and never overly rich and powerful. And I always think that Chardonnays have that margarita quality, that sort of fresh and salty and, but still with structure. And you just want to keep drinking them. And they age. Both the Cabs and the Chardonnays can age beautifully, but mine don't last that long. They don't last long enough to age them too much.
And then expanding a little bit then, so Wine Enthusiast now is your main gig, writer at large, your title, and your beat includes Australia and New Zealand. What are the styles and regions that are exciting you?
Oh my gosh, that's such a big question, Ed. Well, I already talked about Margaret River, but to really just draw a broad brushstroke with Australia, Tasmania has been so exciting for so long and is just getting better and better. We see criminally few Tasmanian wines over here, and it kind of kills me. But I did get to go over there. It's been a while now. I think it was like 2019, but it's such a special part of the world, and everything from the Rieslings to the cool climate Syrah there to the obviously the sparklings and the Pinots. I just love what's coming out of Tasmania. But I mean, Victoria alone, it's there's so much cool stuff coming out of Victoria. I mean, I love some of the producers in Gippsland, obviously Bill Downey and Pat Sullivan, and those guys are doing over in Gippsland. I think that is just a real untapped potential. Well, it's starting to be tapped, but still so much untapped potential in Gippsland. I mean, it's so much, but definitely I am personally more drawn to cool climate. But that being said, I was just in South Australia in November and, seeing what they're doing, even with, there's so much Shiraz in the ground, but there's some producers that are saying, well, okay, instead of ripping up this Shiraz, what can we do to make Shiraz that maybe is a little more suitable to palates these days that are suiting more like mid-weight, fresher styles. And, it's hard. Those climates are warm, but it's really cool to see producers sort of thinking outside the box, even with these more traditional varieties that have been in the ground for a long time, and just starting to farm a lot better. I mean, especially the regenerative side for me is really exciting to see in these warmer climates where, you can farm regeneratively, really keep a lot of the, the compost and not sort of be tilling and turning the soil. And you can have temperatures like 10 degrees cooler or 20 degrees, huge differences in your vineyards just from the way that you're farming, just from this more regenerative approach. So that's exciting from the farming side of things. You're seeing more and more of that. I think Australians are just really innovative bunch, and because it's the new world, right? They can do whatever they want to do. And that's just what's always exciting. I mean, it's a ridiculously large region for me to try, and 65 wine regions, 65 GIs, to try to keep track of. But every time I'm there, I'm always just blown away at the base level of quality that comes out of Oz. The bar is so high. And I actually do think that's where something like the wine show system comes into play, because it keeps the bar high. Aussies are really serious about wine. That was something that really surprised me when I moved there. It's a very laid back culture, but they're very serious and pretty knowledgeable about wine. And I really respect that. And I think it really shows in the final wines.
Absolutely. And from your perspective, not representing them, but covering them from the United States, how good is the understanding that you come across? What's the feedback like that comes to you in terms of this picture? How much is it on people's radar among your readers and the general wine community over there?
I'm going to be honest, not a lot. And that was a big shock when I came here, because I think when I first moved, I thought, well, I'm not, naive enough to believe I'm going to get every Aussie wine that I had there here. But I was really shocked to see how little it is here in small amounts. And now we actually do have some cool, and some of them have been long standing. I don't want to say it's a just thing. Some of them have been around since the 90s and have been bringing in cool stuff. It's just that it's brought in very small quantities, and it's still not on the radars of a lot of people. We don't have Australian wine sections in wine shops. We don't have, even in top Michelin star restaurants, you might be lucky to see a couple of Aussie wines on the list. And usually I wouldn't say they're particularly exciting. Aussie wine, not always. And there are certainly exceptions, but it's not nearly on the radars of Americans as much as I would like. It's still kind of confounding, although there is a very long history as to why that is. I think also something that's been lacking is the cheerleader. There haven't been a lot of people on the ground here that have spent time in Australia and that understand just how great and diverse the Aussie wine scene is. And even that is starting to change. Like Wine Australia is finally getting people back over there after this, COVID. I think it was like 4 or 5 years of nobody going over. So they're finally getting American somms and buyers and journos back over there to put boots on the ground, because that's really the only way you're going to, I think, really breed cheerleaders is by getting people there physically. So, it's happening slowly.
I was going to say as well, they've also got, in terms of cheerleaders / advocates / just people who are knowledgeable and passionately covering it, obviously with Wine Advocate and Erin covering it, you at Wine Enthusiast, John Ross and Jane Lopes as well doing the import business, doing a lot of communication around it. I mean, you have to say, at least there may be headwinds in the trade world at the moment in terms of conditions there. That's not helping anyone. But it's definitely true that the word is, if it's not getting out, it's definitely being said, I think, very eloquently over in the States. So hopefully that has a bit of a filter through. And just briefly, I guess the same question goes to New Zealand, which for many people was a Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc story that perhaps turned into a Pinot Noir story. But is there more than that filtering through into the States? Or where are we with the recognition and affection for New Zealand wines?
New Zealand is a different story in terms of the American perception, in that I think it's still very, very heavily dominated, as you mentioned, with Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. The U.S. is the biggest export market for New Zealand by far. I can't remember the exact figures. Over 80% is Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough. So it is still very much what's being drunk. And you do see Marlborough Sauvignon Blancs. Often it's on a by the glass, and it's, maybe the second, or it's not like the cheapest one, but it's usually maybe the second or third in the by the glass section on the wine list. New Zealand is more, and this is what kind of kills me, is because, when you think about the actual quantities in the and the size of New Zealand versus the size of Australia, it is more on the radar. If you kind of polled the average wine drinking American, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of them said they thought New Zealand made more wine than Oz, just because it's so much more on their radar because of that one style. But that is also can work against, and does work against, New Zealand being a sort of one-trick pony and then having to say, hey, no, look over here, we're doing all this other great stuff. Even Pinot has been really tough. Pinot had a lot of growth in sort of the 90s and the early 2000s, and then since then has just kind of plateaued or even fallen off a little bit in the States. And I was also just in New Zealand in Marlborough and Otago, and there for the Pinot Noir conference in February. And the Pinot, especially Otago, we know that. We all know how good they are. They're better than ever. The Pinots are just beautiful. And not just Pinot, there was some beautiful Gamay, and there's some sparklings and some great Riesling. Of course, we know New Zealand, as wine folks, that New Zealand makes a lot more than Sauvignon Blanc. But that story is hard to tell, to get people, to look beyond Sauvignon Blanc. The disadvantage that Oz can have sometimes is because Oz is so diverse, it doesn't have that one hook, that one way for people to go, oh yeah, I drink Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, so I can then, I can then go in through that way and try their Riesling or their Pinot Noir. It's tough. There's Shiraz, but even that, it wouldn't be the first thing that a lot of Americans go to drink if they want a red wine, if I'm honest.
So not particularly easy times in the wine growing and selling stakes in various parts of the world, and that goes for down here, but absolutely some amazing wine being made both in Australia and New Zealand by some pretty damn cool people, and that will continue. So hopefully better times ahead. I just want to talk very, very briefly, because I've got obviously a more juicy subject for you coming up, but you're covering England, and I do find that quite interesting. Emma Rice was a guest on the podcast, former Hudson Valley winemaker, and it almost amuses me. I mean, you love London, but you've got to be covering a bit of English wine in the States. But who's listening to that story, and what is the story as far as you're concerned?
I love covering English wine. It's funny, in terms of the amount that we get in the States, and therefore the amount that I review, it's a drop in the ocean, as you can imagine. But I love covering it from a storytelling perspective because it's new and exciting for people. Of course, it's not new, but I mean, in terms of putting it on Americans' consciousness, everybody loves bubbles. So you can just go, here, try this bubbles, and they'll be like, that's delicious. And you can say, that's from England. And they go, what? It's still so new and exciting to Americans. It's still very much under the radar in terms of like mainstream drinkers, I guess, even understanding that the UK makes wine. But wine people understand it, and wine people are interested in it. For me, it's been fascinating to watch from an outsider the evolution of English wine, because when I left London, and I remember going to some of the trade tastings in London, some of the English wine trade tastings, and, there were still the ridge views, that were in the Nye Timbers, of course, that were in a good vintage, could make really good sparkling. And then there was a lot of wine, including from them in a cold vintage, where it would strip the enamel off your teeth. Like, it was so acidic and so underripe. And that has been pretty incredible. It's terrifying from a climate change perspective, right? I was there last year, and I focused a little more that trip on still wines and to what's happening out in the Crouch Valley. I don't know if Emma touched upon this, but the whole scene in Essex and the Crouch Valley with still wines. I mean, I tasted, in granted warmer vintages, 13-14% Pinots from England. I mean, if you had told me that in 2012, like, no, I would never have believed you. So it's deeply disturbing climatically, but it's also kind of exciting from a wine geek perspective, because there is so much happening there. And there's now some really cool urban wineries in London and in Oxford and other places as well. So you have your more traditional guys that are really still leading the way, your Gusbournes and your Chapel Downs and those guys. But then there's just this whole swell of, like what Tim Wildman's doing with Lost in a Field. And like I say, some of these urban wineries, like guys that are not even working with the traditional champagne varieties, that are just saying, hey, let's take these like unloved Germanic hybrids that, everybody's ripping out. Let's use those and like, let's rebrand it into, which is happening in New York too. Like, let's rebrand this into something that's cool and funky and, make a little pink patinette out of it. To me, that's a sign of a mature wine market. When you have a mature wine scene, when you now have not only the leaders, but then this whole swell of the avant-garde producers coming in too, that really shows you how far that industry has come. And it's still evolving. It's super exciting and / disturbing.
Yeah, that's a great little wrap. Funnily enough, Emma did mention Crouch Valley, and she said that getting out the car, she was reminded of her first time in the Napa, just seeing vines everywhere. And that, to me, was quite mind-blowing, because certainly when I grew up in England, Essex was not known, obviously, for lots of vineyards, but yes.
Well, and probably literally a Napa stamp, because a lot of those vines are probably the Jackson family's wines. Jackson family has invested hugely in England and planted a lot of vines in the Crouch Valley.
Now, you mentioned hybrids, which brings us back home, where I think we're going to finish this conversation, to New York. First of all, could you just tell us a little bit about the hybrids and that tradition? And also, we're going to catch up a little bit on what's hot in Finger Lakes, Hudson Valley, and some other things there. So starting off just with the hybrid story and those varieties, just so that people understand what you're talking about if they referenced.
Yeah, sure. So hybrids, again, a broad brush stroke, but basically they're a cross when you take a variety that is a non-vinifera and a vinifera and cross it. And now what's happened in New York, it's even more... We've crossed, right? So you can cross a hybrid with another hybrid, and like there might be some vinifera parentage, and there's some hybrid, and maybe there's a cross of 3-4. The lineage gets quite complicated, but basically hybrids were, I guess, sort of invented, created. Most of them were, in a lab or in a nursery somewhere in order to grow grapevines in climates that are too cold for vinifera vines. So in the States, we have native varieties, and these are from other species. And we have a long, rich history in the States dating back to early 1800s of making wines from native grape varieties. And then as early as sort of the mid 1800s, we then also have these hybrids that started to be introduced. Now, of course, we have a thriving vinifera scene as well, which is, of course, all the European varieties that we know. I guess I can speak more from the lens of New York State because that's the place that I cover, so the history that I know best. So vinifera really didn't come in until around the 50s, around the 1950s. And so before then, it was all hybrids. And now we sort of interchange that with heritage or sort of these old hybrid varieties. Some of them they call French hybrids, like Saval Blanc, like crossed with French varieties. Some of them have been around for a long time. Some of them are as new as 10, 15 years old. Like Cornell University is one of the major hubs of grape breeding in the States. And they just came out with a new one that's a cross of Riesling and a hybrid. That just got named and really put onto the market in the last couple of years. So this is still ongoing, the sort of creation of these hybrids. And the same thing is happening with these German hybrids for England to allow them to grow in England when it was too cool. And now a lot of them are being grubbed up and planted with, of course, Pinot and Chardonnay mostly. So around the 1950s for New York, at least, and for a lot of these cool climate regions, once vinifera was introduced, a lot of these hybrids kind of went by the wayside. A lot of them got ripped up. They were mostly at the time being made into pretty cheap sweet wines. They were often described as being foxy, having this foxy sort of animal-like flavors and aromas, so not considered quality. I think there's a whole interesting conversation to be had around colonialism that you can tie in with that about, sort of holding up these European varieties from certain countries as being superior to the hybrids. But, that was the mentality then of like, these are the grape varieties that can make good wines and these are the ones that don't. But what we're seeing now is this resurgence of a lot of those varieties, but being farmed well and being used often. It's very tied with the natural movement. So often you see them with some skin contact as an orange wine if it's a white, or as a patinat, or just being blended together. So less focus on a single variety hybrid. I don't think there's many folks out there saying, okay, we need to learn a whole other sort of library of varieties. They're saying, no, we're going to actually take this and maybe we'll blend it with our Riesling or our vinifera. It doesn't matter as much because we can just get consistency across the board. They're tying it in with the environmental side of things, which is that these varieties are far more suited to the climate here and they don't need to be sprayed nearly as heavily. So there is the environmental impact to consider. And there's the heritage and the history of a lot of these ones that have been in the ground for a long time. So it's really interesting. It's a whole kind of resurgence that's happening. I say whole, I mean, it's a bit like natural wine. It's still very niche and it's still very small, but in the wine world, I think it's quite exciting.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you make that point about colonialism because that is what it often boils down to, isn't it? Suppressing the potential of things in favour of others is obviously going to hold back their progress. And it's good that they're being discovered. And it is a relatively young scene. I mean, whenever we talk about Australia and the United States, of course, there are vine plantings and there is heritage going back a very long way in wine growing. But at the same time, much of the scene has been developed so much later than obviously the traditions of France, for example. So we're still discovering things and things weren't necessarily done the best way the first time round. So again, it's a constantly evolving story and I think it's really good that you're covering it. And on that front, Finger Lakes. How would you characterize the growing conditions in Finger Lakes and what is exciting about it?
Sure. So the Finger Lakes is, the biggest wine region in New York. There's Long Island and the Hudson River and Niagara, other places, but Finger Lakes by far the biggest. I think it produces over 80% of wine grapes. There is a thriving table grape scene. That's another story. But Finger Lakes is right in the center of the state. There's 11 lakes. They're these sort of long digit-shaped, very deep lakes. There's really only 3 or 4, maybe 5 that really are the heart of wine country. By far the most wineries are on Seneca Lake, but then some of the founding wineries and those with the longest history are on Cayuga Lake, which is to the west of that. You have Cayuga Lake. It's a bit confusing. Cayuga and Cayuga Lake, west and east of Seneca, but I would say the real heart of Finger Lakes wine growing is Seneca Lake, and it's also the deepest because you have these deep deep, glacially formed, pretty ancient, not ancient by Australian soil standards, but ancient by our soil standards. These glacially formed deep lakes, they kind of moderate what would otherwise be a very cool climate. So this is 4 distinct seasons up there: snow in the winter, hot, humid summers. We get beautiful autumns, beautiful spring. Of course, with climate change, a lot more chaos and less predictability around that. But the reason why vinifera can work up there, and the reason it isn't too cold in those snowy winters, is because those lakes moderate the temperature in the winter. That's not to say that when they have a really cold winter, they can still get a fair amount of vine damage. But for the most part, it's what allows cool climate vinifera varieties to work. So this has been really since the 50s or 60s, really the home of Riesling. Riesling is, I would say the most famous New York State and arguably East Coast wine in the States. And so they've been very serious about Riesling for a long time. It's a variety that works very, very well up there in all shapes and sizes. But lately there is a lot more focus on some of these more midweight spicy reds like Cab Franc and Blaufränkisch, which they also sometimes call Lemberger. It's interchangeable, the Austrian and the German term for it, but those have been really exciting. They're banging the drum hard for Chardonnay, but I have to say, having just declared my love for Margaret River Chardonnay, I have yet to be convinced about Finger Lake Chardonnay. I think for now I like it more in sparkling. And that being said, I really like sparkling. I think sparkling across the board in New York State makes a whole lot of sense. They have fabulous natural acidity, especially if you can start sort of a non-vintage program where you're blending back in, because obviously there's a lot of vintage variation in this part of the world. I really love the sparklings coming out of there. I love sparkling Riesling. I mean, Riesling with bubbles, like you can't go wrong. It's just so delicious.
Okay.
And then, like I said, this whole sort of avant-garde hybrid movement that's coming up, where you have these small producers who can usually get these. They're usually buying in. Some of them are planting, but usually buying in hybrid varieties that, are a lot cheaper than the vinifera varieties to buy the fruit in, and just doing some funky, fun stuff with it, putting it in cans and making pet nats and piquettes. And so that's happening too. And again, that to me is a really great sign of a mature wine scene, when you have an avant-garde, more creative, experimental movement happening on the fringes.
Yeah, speaking of fringe, Blaufränkisch from the Finger Lakes sounds like a very cool thing that I'd like to try. And also, spoiler alert, but not really, we're going to talk a little bit about sparkling in a bonus segment in a minute, which I'm looking forward to. What about Hudson Valley?
That's where I live now and where I've lived for the last 10 years. So even though I'm from the Finger Lakes, this is really my adopted home. This is actually the oldest continually producing vineyard in America and the oldest winery in America. So really rich history here, selling grapes and wine to New York City. So you can imagine it. So we're just north of the city, about 90 miles north. So you can imagine you have this huge customer base right there. A lot of Italians, speaking of like a generation where they would buy a lot of fruit from the Hudson Valley to make homemade wine. Even throughout Prohibition, there were wineries here who kept going and made wine for medicinal purposes, or who, sold it for less legal channels, shall we say, but who were able to keep going. A lot did shut down, but there were some that stayed afloat. So we have the Hudson River, but a lot of the vineyards are actually quite far from the river. The river doesn't have as much of an effect on this region as we'd like to think it does. It's a tough place particularly to grow vinifera varieties, because it is wet and humid and there's high disease pressure. It's a great place to grow other crops. It's one of the food baskets of America, but it's a tough place for grapes that like, tough infertile soils and dry, they don't like humidity. That being said, Cabernet Franc does really well here. And there are some producers here, and I guess I can shout out to like Fjord. They also have Ben Marl Winery. That's the oldest continuous vineyard. So Fjord is making like some great rosé out of Cab Franc. Millbrook, Malaya, who are kind of showing that they can take vinifera, and if it's farmed well and made well, it works. It's just, this is pretty high input farming. And so this is actually the region that I think has the most potential to take those hybrid and heritage varieties, because they've got that rich story there already, and to run with it. And there's a few producers, Wild Ark Farm, Hudson Chatham. There are a few producers that are doing that. There's a project called Dear Native Grapes, like deep out in the Catskills, that are kind of reviving. We have this wonderful grape historian here who's helping them to bring back some of these varieties and to tell that story through a different lens, and to market it to a whole generation of natty wine drinkers that doesn't even care about the variety anyway. They're not even putting them on the label half the time. But we're at the very beginning. This is like super early days, I think, with hybrid, with that movement, I guess.
Well, that's great. It's good to have the listeners ahead of the curve. And on a final note, all this talk, I mean, it's Friday where I am. It's still Thursday where you are. What glass of wine would you most like to have next out of all the places that you cover?
Oh my gosh, that's such a hard question. Well, it's dinner time and I've been drinking a glass of wine as we've been talking, and it hasn't been from any of my beets. It's been a delicious Chenin Blanc from South Africa. I'm writing an article on South Africa, and it's A.A. Badenhorst, if you know him, from Swartland, who's awesome. So I'm enjoying this Chenin, and I really wish we had more Chenin in Australia, because I know there's some delicious Aussie Chenin, and we don't get hardly any of it. That is such a tough question. I can't single out any of my beets because I feel loyalty to all four of them. I really do. And I really like I feel like a mother hen with all four. But I'll say, and this will lead nicely to the bonus content, I'll say a sparkling wine from any of those four regions, a traditional method. Give me like a Blanc de Blanc. I'll say Blanc de Blanc because I do really love that style, like brioche with some like fabulous, precise acidity in there. Like I will take that from any four. Australia, New Zealand, England, or New York all make delicious examples.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed listening to it, please like, subscribe, and share it with your tribe. Seriously, it makes a big difference. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmarison.substack.com. Feel free to leave a comment too. I'd love to know what you'd like to hear more of. But for now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Elizabeth Clancy for the edit, and to my guest, Christina Pickard. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers!